Amanda Halterman did not fade out. She vanished. One day she was there, steady, outspoken, holding the family together. The next day, she was gone. No goodbye. No on-screen exit. No post from TLC. Filming stopped so fast it rattled the crew, and the silence after felt louder than any reunion fight. Fans noticed before the network did. Clips felt shorter. Scenes felt clipped. Something was missing. And it was not subtle. What makes this hit harder is how wrong the timing feels. Amanda was not spiraling. She was not losing control. She was not begging for attention. She was calm. Then, everything froze. When a production machine goes quiet overnight, people inside panic. When a network refuses to explain, people outside start connecting dots. And when the person at the center refuses to rant, refuses to cry online, refuses to spill, that is when alarms go off. Because loud exits are easy to manage. Quiet ones are not. Silence with intent shakes systems built on access. Amanda chose no interviews, no statements, no mess. That choice alone changed the tone from drama to danger. Something serious happened off camera, and the people in charge hoped you would never ask why. Before everything stopped, before the silence got uncomfortable, Amanda Halterman had quietly become the emotional anchor of the show. Not because producers told you she was important, but because viewers felt it. She didn't enter scenes looking for sympathy or applause. She showed up like someone who had already lived a full life off camera and wasn't interested in performing one for approval. That alone made her different. Amanda's role was never about being the loudest in the room. It was about being the one who could say the thing everyone else was thinking, without turning it into chaos. When tensions flared, she didn't hide. When emotions ran high, she didn't dramatize them. She stood her ground with a mix of blunt honesty and dry humor that felt real, not rehearsed. Viewers recognized that instantly. Reality TV trains audiences to spot exaggeration, and Amanda didn't exaggerate. She reacted like a sister, a daughter, a woman who had limits and wasn't ashamed of them. Over time, that consistency built trust. Not the kind of trust that comes from being perfect, but the kind that comes from being predictable in the best way. You knew where Amanda stood. You knew she would defend her family, but you also knew she wouldn't excuse behavior that crossed a line. She could be tough without being cruel, emotional without unraveling. In a space where reactions are often inflated for effect, her responses felt grounded, almost refreshing. That's why viewers leaned in when she spoke. Even when you didn't fully agree with her, you understood her logic. She didn't switch personalities depending on who was in the room. She didn't soften her tone to please producers or sharpen it to create moments. What you saw was what you got, and in reality television, that is rare currency. There was also something else working quietly in her favor. Amanda never chased the spotlight. She didn't hijack storylines or turn every conflict into a personal arc. She stepped forward when needed and stepped back when it wasn't her moment. That restraint made her feel reliable. It made her feel safe. When scenes got uncomfortable, Amanda often became the emotional translator for the audience, reacting the way viewers at home were reacting, asking the questions they were asking. And that's where things get complicated. Because the same traits that made her trusted also made her difficult to control. A steady presence is useful until it refuses to bend. A grounded voice is welcome until it starts pointing out uncomfortable truths. Strength is celebrated right up until it disrupts the narrative someone else is trying to shape. As the seasons moved forward, Amanda's clarity didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. She set boundaries more clearly. She pushed back when conversations felt manipulative. She didn't crumble under pressure, and she didn't play along when situations felt forced. To viewers, that looked like growth. To a production environment built on escalation, it can look like resistance. That's the tension people didn't notice at first. The show needed drama. Amanda provided stability. The show thrives on emotional swings. Amanda stayed centered. The more reliable she became to the audience, the harder it became to fit her neatly into a storyline that demanded extremes. So when she disappeared, it didn't just feel like another cast change. It felt wrong. It felt personal. Someone who had earned trust doesn't just vanish without explanation. Someone that's solid doesn't suddenly become expendable without a reason. And that question lingered quietly beneath the surface, waiting for people to realize that strength in the wrong environment can become a liability. If you go back and watch closely, the shift doesn't announce itself. It creeps in through small choices. A reaction shot held a second longer than necessary. A sentence cut just before its context. Moments that once felt balanced start leaning in one direction. In my opinion, this is where the pressure began to build, not through explosions, but through framing. Amanda didn't suddenly change her behavior. The way it was presented did. Conversations where she calmly set boundaries were increasingly followed by tense music cues. Her pauses were treated like defiance. Her firmness was edited to feel sharp. Allegedly, the goal wasn't to make her look unreasonable outright, but to tilt perception just enough that viewers might start questioning her tone instead of her point. This is a familiar pattern in reality television. Conflict doesn't always come from what people do, but from how their actions are stitched together. When someone refuses to escalate emotionally, the edit often has to work harder. Silence becomes suspicious. Directness becomes aggression. In Amanda's case, moments that once read as grounded started being framed as confrontational, even when the words themselves hadn't changed. What stood out was how often her reactions were isolated. You'd see Amanda respond, but not always the full setup that led there. A boundary would be shown without the push that forced it. A firm response would appear without the repeated provocation behind it. In my opinion, that selective context matters because it subtly shifts blame without ever stating it outright. As the episodes progressed, the contrast became clearer. Others could raise their voices, cry, storm off, and still be presented as overwhelmed or misunderstood. When Amanda did something far calmer, like saying no or refusing to engage, it was framed as cold or hostile. That imbalance didn't go unnoticed by long-time viewers, even if they couldn't immediately name it. Conflict was being amplified, but not in the obvious ways. Instead of adding fights, the show added tension through suggestion. Music swelled where it hadn't before. Reaction shots lingered on facial expressions. Editing leaned into moments of stillness and turned them into implied threats. Allegedly, this kind of amplification is designed to nudge audiences emotionally without changing the facts on the surface. From a behavioral standpoint, Amanda's responses remained consistent. She didn't escalate. She didn't lash out. She articulated limits and disengaged when conversations felt unproductive. In everyday life, that reads as emotional regulation. In a reality TV environment that thrives on chaos, it can be interpreted as resistance. That resistance is where trust can fracture. When someone stops reacting the way a system expects them to, pressure builds behind the scenes. Producers rely on participation as much as performance. If a cast member starts controlling their own emotional output, it limits the angles available for storytelling. In my opinion, that's often when subtle framing shifts begin. The real question isn't whether Amanda became more aggressive, it's whether the narrative around her was slowly redirected to create friction where none naturally existed. At some point, that redirection appears to have crossed an internal line. Something changed. Whether it was a conversation, an edit she saw, or a moment where she realized how she was being portrayed, The trust that once existed didn't hold. Viewers could feel it before they fully understood it. Scenes felt heavier. Interactions felt loaded. Amanda's presence carried tension that hadn't been there before, not because of what she was doing, but because of how the show was framing her doing it. And once that lens shifts, it's very hard to unsee. At some point, the tension that had been building quietly had to surface. It didn't happen on camera. It didn't happen during a blow-up scene or a dramatic confrontation. It happened behind closed doors, in a room where early cuts are reviewed and expectations are set. This is where cast members are often reminded how things are shaping up, and in Amanda's case, it appears to be where everything changed. According to accounts shared later and patterns that became obvious afterward, Amanda was shown portions of how upcoming episodes were being assembled. Not full episodes, just enough to understand the direction. In my opinion, that partial view can be more unsettling than seeing everything, because it reveals intention without context. What she saw was a version of herself that felt unfamiliar, not exaggerated, not cartoonish, but subtly distorted. A woman who appeared tense, reactive, difficult. A woman defined by friction rather than clarity. She didn't explode, she didn't argue frame by frame. That's the part people often misunderstand. When someone recognizes a misrepresentation that can't be corrected with one note or one conversation, yelling feels pointless. Allegedly, Amanda went quiet. She listened. She let the room fill with explanations about pacing, storytelling, and what plays well on screen. And the more those explanations came, the clearer it became that this wasn't about a single edit. What she was being shown wasn't an accident. It was a direction, a lane she was expected to stay in. In my opinion, that realization hits differently when you know you didn't behave the way you're being framed. It creates a kind of internal standoff. Do you argue and risk being labeled difficult? Or do you comply and watch your image slowly shift into something you don't recognize? Amanda chose neither. Silence, in that moment, became her leverage. She didn't negotiate her personality. She didn't offer emotional access in exchange for better framing. She stopped feeding the process. That decision alone can disrupt an entire production schedule because cooperation is the currency that keeps reality television moving. There's a reason this kind of refusal causes panic. When a cast member won't react, won't explain themselves, won't perform discomfort on cue, the system loses control of the narrative. Scenes can't be shaped if the subject won't participate. Storylines stall. Schedules collapse. Allegedly, that room shifted quickly once it became clear Amanda wasn't going to play along. No one stormed out dramatically. No doors slammed. The tension came from what wasn't said. She stood up calmly. She acknowledged what she had seen. And before leaving, she made it clear she would not continue under those terms. Exactly what she said hasn't been publicly confirmed, but the outcome speaks for itself. Filming didn't resume the same way. Her presence disappeared without resolution. From a production standpoint, that's a nightmare scenario. From a personal standpoint, it's a boundary. In my opinion, this was the moment trust broke completely. Not because of an argument, but because the illusion of mutual understanding fell apart. Amanda realized the version of herself being sold to viewers was no longer hers to control. That's why the reaction afterward felt so abrupt. Projects don't halt overnight unless something fundamental has shifted. Whatever was said in that room didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be final. The aftermath didn't look like a typical reality TV exit. There was no dramatic wrap-up scene, no confessional explaining feelings, no carefully worded goodbye meant to soften the blow. Instead, everything stalled. Filming schedules were disrupted. Scenes that were already planned stopped moving forward. In situations like this, when a cast member leaves suddenly, the machine usually scrambles to reframe the story. That didn't happen here, at least not publicly. In my opinion, the speed of the shutdown is what raised eyebrows. Productions are built to absorb chaos. Arguments, breakdowns, even public scandals can be managed with edits and press releases. What they struggle with is unpredictability paired with refusal. Allegedly, once it became clear Amanda was no longer cooperating, the usual tools stopped working. You can't film someone who isn't there, and you can't shape a narrative when the subject won't participate at all. Behind the scenes, this is typically where legal conversations begin. Not lawsuits necessarily, but risk assessments. What footage can be used? What agreements still apply? What statements can be made without creating exposure? When silence replaces storytelling, caution takes over. Footage gets paused. Review processes slow down. Every decision suddenly requires approval instead of instinct. What stood out most was the absence of closure. No exit interview aired. No on-screen explanation filled the gap. In reality television, closure is currency. It reassures viewers and protects the brand. The fact that none was offered suggests that saying something carried more risk than saying nothing. In my opinion, that choice alone signals fear, not confidence. Silence unsettles systems because it removes their ability to steer perception. Noise can be redirected. Outbursts can be contextualized. Emotional rants can be edited down. Silence leaves room for interpretation, and interpretation belongs to the audience. That's a loss of control no network wants, especially one built on carefully managed narratives. From the outside, fans noticed the gap immediately. Episodes felt disjointed. Scenes that should have included Amanda simply didn't. Conversations referenced moments viewers never saw. The absence became its own storyline, one the network refused to acknowledge. Allegedly, that refusal wasn't about ignoring the audience, but about avoiding a precedent. Explaining why someone left under contested circumstances invites scrutiny into how the show operates. Institutionally, that kind of scrutiny is dangerous. It shifts focus from personalities to process. It makes viewers question not just what they're watching, but how it's being assembled. In my opinion, that's the real fallout that followed Amanda's walkout. Not drama, but doubt. What happens when a cast member exits loudly is predictable. What happens when they exit quietly is harder to contain. Amanda didn't accuse. She didn't expose. She didn't demand. She simply removed herself. That move forced everyone else into reaction mode, and reactions without a script tend to reveal more than planned statements ever could. The network's silence became the loudest response in the room. It told viewers that something had gone wrong, even if no one would say what. It suggested there were limits to what could be shared without opening doors that couldn't be closed again. And as the weeks passed with no clarification, the question shifted from why Amanda left to why the people in charge were so determined not to explain it. That's when the story stopped being about one person and started becoming about power, control, and what happens when someone steps outside the system without making a scene. Once the official voices went quiet, the audience stepped in. It didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't led by influencers or headlines. It started with regular viewers doing what they always do when something feels off. They rewatched. They slowed clips down. They compared early episodes to later ones. And slowly, a different picture began to form. Fans noticed how often Amanda's reactions were shown without their full setup. They pointed out moments where conversations clearly started earlier than what aired. A boundary would appear out of nowhere, followed by tension without the push that caused it. In isolation, each moment felt minor. Together they formed a pattern. In my opinion, that pattern is what shifted the narrative. People began sharing side-by-side comparisons. Early seasons showed Amanda as calm and direct. Later ones emphasized tight shots and uneasy music. The words she used hadn't changed much, but the framing had. Allegedly, once viewers saw that contrast, it became hard to unsee. The idea that she had suddenly become aggressive didn't hold up under closer inspection. That's when the language changed. Fans stopped saying she quit. They started saying she escaped, not in a dramatic, sensational way, but in a quiet reframing that carried weight. Escaping implies leaving something unhealthy, not abandoning responsibility. It suggests self-preservation rather than failure. In my opinion, that shift mattered because it took power away from the storyline that had been forming on screen. Online discussions became less about personalities and more about process. How much of what we see is guided? How often are calm reactions reinterpreted to manufacture tension? Viewers who had watched reality TV for years recognized the signs, even if they had never articulated them before. Amanda's absence became a case study rather than a scandal. What's interesting is that this wasn't driven by outrage. There were no mass boycotts or trending hashtags demanding answers. Instead, there was something quieter and more unsettling for a network: skepticism. Viewers didn't stop watching immediately. They started watching differently. They questioned edits. They paused before accepting narratives at face value. In my opinion, that kind of audience shift is far more damaging than temporary backlash. Outrage burns hot and fades. Doubt lingers. Once viewers feel like they've spotted the seams, the illusion becomes harder to maintain. Every future conflict gets re-examined through that lens. Amanda's silence played a role in that shift. Without a competing narrative from her, fans weren't reacting to statements or defending quotes. They were analyzing what already existed. Allegedly, that forced the conversation to stay grounded in observable details rather than speculation. The authority quietly moved from insiders to the audience. Producers no longer controlled the interpretation. Fans did. They decided what felt authentic and what felt manufactured, and many came to the same conclusion independently, which made it harder to dismiss as bias or loyalty. The bigger question started to surface naturally. If this could happen here, where else has it happened? If a steady, trusted cast member could be reframed so subtly, what does that say about other storylines that rely heavily on emotional extremes? In my opinion, that's where the credibility issue truly begins. The show didn't collapse overnight. But something cracked. Viewers who once watched passively now watched actively. And once an audience realizes it has been doing unpaid editing work in its own head, trust doesn't return easily. Whether the show can survive that kind of awareness isn't about ratings in the short term. It's about whether viewers believe what they're being shown is still rooted in something real. Amanda's absence didn't need loud headlines to explain itself. People close to her hinted at the strain long before cameras stopped rolling. The long hours, the constant retakes, the pressure to react in ways that weren't natural, all of it was taking a toll. Allegedly, she had started noticing physical signs that something was off: fatigue that wouldn't go away, irregular heartbeats, and the kind of shortness of breath that made everyday tasks feel like a challenge. For someone used to holding herself together in front of cameras, those signals weren't just inconvenient, they were impossible to ignore. Emotionally, it had been wearing on her too. Amanda had always been seen as the calm, steady presence, the voice that made sense when chaos threatened to spiral. But behind the scenes, the constant pressure to justify every action, to explain every pause, to perform even when she didn't feel like it, added layers of stress most viewers never see. In my opinion, choosing to step back wasn't dramatic, it was necessary. She wasn't quitting for attention. She was creating a buffer to protect her mental health and preserve the dignity she had built over years on screen. Fans speculated endlessly online. Was it a stunt? A strategic move to leverage contracts? The answer, if we listen to credible sources, is no. Walking away gave her control in a system that thrives on manipulation. Silence can be powerful, but in this case, it was also safe. By not posting a public statement, by not calling out producers or disputing edits, she avoided the spiral of reaction and counter-reaction that often dominates social media. Allegedly, that restraint itself unsettled the production team. Health concerns also grounded her exit in reality. The stories of exhaustion, sleep disruption, and stress-induced physical symptoms weren't being exaggerated for drama. They were consistent with what happens to anyone under relentless scrutiny, while being asked to act in ways that conflict with instinct. In my opinion, recognizing that human cost is essential to understanding her choices. Without it, it's easy to misinterpret the exit as ego or defiance instead of self-preservation. Her move also reframed the conversation about boundaries in reality television. Many cast members comply because speaking up risks exposure, fines, or being written off. Amanda's decision illustrated an alternative. Stepping away without a fight can speak volumes. She didn't have to argue. She didn't have to confront. Her absence made her point quietly but unmistakably. This decision left the door open for reflection. Viewers could see what compliance costs and what agency looks like when exercised responsibly. They could examine the pressures that come with fame, editing manipulation, and public expectation. In my opinion, her choice reframed success. Leaving on her own terms didn't diminish her contributions, it highlighted them. Fans began to hope for a next chapter. Will Amanda return in a different capacity? Will she speak publicly? Those questions linger, intentionally unanswered, keeping the narrative alive while maintaining her privacy. In my opinion, that uncertainty strengthens her position. It reminds us all that power doesn't have to be loud to be felt, and sometimes the quietest moves shake the hardest systems. Walking away, preserving health, and maintaining silence became a deliberate statement. It wasn't about ratings, controversy, or spectacle. It was about claiming agency in an environment built to erode it. For those paying attention, Amanda's exit is a lesson in prioritizing well-being, integrity, and self-respect over visibility and approval. Her next steps are unknown, but the impact of her choices is already evident, and it will shape both the audience and the show's narrative for seasons to come. What happens when someone refuses to be molded by the machine, and silence becomes louder than any argument? When a cast member finally says no, it ripples farther than any argument or social media post ever could. Amanda didn't yell. She didn't storm out with cameras rolling. She simply chose herself over a system that thrives on bending personalities into conflict. That single act shifted the power balance. Suddenly, it wasn't just about what producers wanted to show. It was about what she refused to let them show. In my opinion, that refusal speaks louder than any dramatic confrontation ever could. Dignity over drama isn't flashy, but it's disruptive. For years, reality TV has relied on predictable chaos, amplified fights, edited outrage, carefully engineered tension. When someone like Amanda removes herself quietly, it exposes the mechanics. It reveals how much control a network actually has, and how much it can lose when someone opts out. Fans, producers, and even other cast members are reminded that cooperation isn't a given, that credibility matters more than spectacle, and that silence can become a strategic weapon. Her move flips the story entirely. The network becomes reactive. Fans start noticing patterns they previously ignored. The show itself is forced to adjust, at least internally, because the illusion of control has been cracked. Silence, in this context, is louder than any argument, any scandal, any viral clip. It's a lesson in agency. Stepping away can be as potent as stepping up. Maybe more. And now, The story keeps moving. One system's loss of control hints at another brewing moment where boundaries are tested and power slips in ways no one expects. Watch closely, because when someone refuses to be played, the consequences echo far beyond the screen. What happens when control is no longer guaranteed, and the rules suddenly bend in unexpected ways?